What if I told you the greatest enigma of Stonehenge isn't how it was built, but why? We've all heard tales of summer solstice rituals, but that theory crumbles before one simple question. Why would a prehistoric society need astronomical precision comparable to our own, when a mere stick in the ground would suffice for a basic calendar? Why would they require a granite supercomputer capable of calculating the rarest celestial events with an accuracy of one single day? The answer is simple. Everything we thought we knew about Stonehenge is just the tip of the iceberg. This isn't a story of mystical cults and sacrificial rites. This is a narrative about humanity's very first scientific endeavor. It's a tale of forging a celestial shield. I invite you now to become a co-conspirator in this investigation, to join me in cracking the code etched in stone, and to look beyond a mere pile of boulders to behold the most ambitious device ever conceived by a pre-literate civilization. Let us transport ourselves back 4,500 years to the Salisbury Plain. Try to cast aside everything you think you know and simply feel this world. The air here is thick, damp, and bone-chillingly cold, seeping through coarse woolen garments. It hums with the voices of thousands, speaking a long-dead language, yet the intonations, commands, jests, and cries of pain are universally understood. Intermingled in this air is the scent of sweat from countless bodies, smoke from hundreds of campfires where meat sizzles and barley stew simmers, and the sharp, piercing aroma of freshly quarried stone, smelling of thunder and ozone. And above it all, a relentless, sanity-testing drone. The dull thud of stone mauls, striking sarsen blocks, the grinding rasp of flint axes, and the monotonous creak of wooden sledges, hundreds of people straining to pull them over log rollers. This isn't mere construction. This is a battle against matter itself. To truly comprehend these people, we must crack the code of their consciousness. In their world, there was no such thing as chance. Everything was a sign. And at the heart of their worldview lay two pivotal concepts. The first, the breath of the sky. For them, the heavens were not an empty void. They were a living, breathing organism, the wellspring of life and death. The sun and moon were not merely celestial bodies, but the eyes of this entity, opening and closing. Their movement was its thought, an eclipse, a fit of rage, or a bout of illness. To understand the rhythm of this breath was to grasp the very design of the universe. The second concept, the memory of the earth. The earth held within it the bones of their ancestors, and thus their accumulated wisdom. Mountains and rivers weren't merely landscape features, but the scars and veins upon the body of an ancient progenitor. Each stone possessed its own unique history and power. It was from the collision of these two profound ideas that a third, truly revolutionary concept emerged, the Stone Order. This was the audacious notion that the chaotic breath of the sky could be comprehended, measured, and even predicted. And then, to fix this knowledge for eternity, using the most enduring substance of all, the memory of the earth, stone itself. The builders of Stonehenge weren't merely placing stones. They were harnessing the wisdom of the earth to lock within it the knowledge of the heavens. They were creating an interface between the human realm and the divine. They sought to impose order upon chaos, and their tools for this were not metal, but granite and intellect. This colossal construction, spanning centuries and devouring the resources of an entire region, was subservient to one singular goal. Their contemporaries in Egypt were erecting pyramids, stairways to the afterlife for a single individual, the pharaoh. Here, however, in cold and mist-shrouded Britain, an entire society was building something fundamentally different. This was no monument to death, but a vital instrument for survival. They were constructing a machine capable of foretelling the future. A machine designed to protect them all from the most terrifying thing they could possibly imagine, the moment the sky itself decided to die. These people were not primitive savages adorned with amulets. They were the very first scientific community in European history, The entire Salisbury Plain served as their laboratory. Their blueprints, rows of stakes and taut ropes, their computer, dozens of generations of observers who night after night, year after year, meticulously recorded, not on parchment, but in their memories and in the precise placement of stones, the slightest fluctuations of the lunar and solar cycles. They weren't merely searching for patterns, they were searching for a glitch in the program. That exceedingly rare moment when the cosmic mechanism itself misfired. And if we seek a modern analogy, it would be perfectly precise and undeniably accurate. The Stonehenge project was the Apollo program of the Stone Age. It was a national endeavor that united dozens of tribes, demanded the mobilization of every resource, and attracted the finest minds of its era. Only their goal wasn't to reach the moon. It was, quite the opposite, to comprehend when the moon and sun would conspire to unleash a celestial catastrophe and to be ready for it. This was the boldest scientific project in history, where the stakes weren't national pride, but the very survival of an entire people. The genesis wasn't a stroke of genius, but a cascade of calamities. Imagine several consecutive years when the sky itself seemed to go insane. Spring rains failed to arrive, leaving the earth cracked and parched, dooming crops. Then, without any rhyme or reason, torrential downpours began, drowning what miraculously survived. Animals behaved strangely. Birds fell silent a day before a storm, livestock refused to eat, illnesses began to sweep through, decimating entire families. Society teetered on the brink of collapse, but more terrifying than hunger and epidemics was the sheer bewilderment. Their world, always predictable and cyclical, suddenly morphed into hostile, unpredictable chaos. Power in this world belonged to the keepers of the earth, a caste of priests whose wisdom lay in communion with the spirits of streams, hills, and sacred groves. They tried to solve the problem with time-honored methods. They offered bloody sacrifices, peered into the entrails of animals, and listened for the whispers of the wind. But the spirits remained silent. The earth no longer offered answers. Their rituals, which had worked for centuries, proved powerless. And along with the harvest, their most precious treasure, their authority, withered. They had promised the people stability, but delivered only fear. Their worldview, cozy and contained, was crumbling before their very eyes. And it was in this moment of despair that a person emerged, whom we'll provisionally call the Observer. He was not a chieftain or a priest. He was an outsider, perhaps even an outcast, because he did something strange and, in the eyes of his kin, utterly useless. At night, when everyone else slept, he stayed awake. He watched the sky. For years, he simply observed, noting in his memory the path of the moon, the points of sunrise, the appearance and disappearance of stars. He was the first to notice all the catastrophes on Earth, this entire chain of misfortunes, strangely coincided with barely perceptible anomalies in the heavens. He was particularly concerned by moments when the moon behaved erratically, sometimes soaring too high, at other times barely creeping above the horizon. It was then that an idea was born in his mind, an idea whose audacity rivaled space travel itself. It was incredibly bold, even sacrilegious for that era. He hypothesized, what if the sky isn't a living creature with fickle moods? What if it isn't a deity that needs to be begged and appeased? What if this entire celestial vault is a gigantic, perfectly engineered mechanism operating according to immutable laws? And if it's a mechanism, then it can be studied. Its cogs, its cycles, its rhythm can be understood. And most importantly, its malfunctions can be predicted. He proposed ceasing to pray to chaos and beginning to calculate it. This was a true intellectual bombshell. The Observer did not approach the priests. He understood they would see him only as a rival and a blasphemer. He went instead to the Council of Chieftains, pragmatic individuals responsible for the survival of their tribes. Instead of vague prophecies, he offered them calculations. Instead of sacrifices, technology. He said, I cannot make the rain fall. But I believe I can tell you when the day will come that the sun disappears from the sky. And if we know that day, we can prepare for it. It was the most improbable business plan in history. He asked for resources not for a temple, but for an observatory. The reaction was precisely as one might expect. The keepers of the earth were furious. They accused him of hubris and madness. To try and steal the secrets of the heavens is to enrage the gods. He will bring a disaster upon us such as we have never seen, they cried. For them, his idea was a mortal threat because it shifted the center of power from the capricious earthly spirits to the cold, indifferent mathematics of celestial cycles. It rendered them, the priests, obsolete. This was a conflict not merely between people, but between two opposing worldviews, faith versus knowledge. But the tribal chieftains, weary from famine and fear, found themselves in a difficult position. The old system wasn't working. The new one seemed like madness. And yet, there was an iron logic to the observer's words. He wasn't asking for blind faith. He was proposing an experiment. He asked for people and resources to procure special bluestones from the distant western coast in the Preseli Mountains and to build a small test model of his celestial machine. And the chieftains, driven to desperation, agreed. They gambled their entire future, entrusting it to one man who dared to claim he could read the thoughts of the sky. To understand how Stonehenge operated, we must stop seeing it as a temple and recognize it as a machine. Let's introduce a central metaphor. Stonehenge is a colossal celestial clockwork carved from stone. But its primary function isn't to tell time, it's to predict failures in the universe's operation. Its dial is the horizon, its hands are the sun and moon, and its gears are the immutable laws of gravity. Ancient engineers didn't just create an observatory, they created an analog computer capable of solving one, yet vitally important problem, calculating periods of highest risk when a celestial catastrophe might occur. Now, let's look under the hood of this machine. The entire system operated on one simple but non-obvious principle. The sun is reliable. Its path across the sky is predictable. Its cycles are stable. The summer and winter solstices are unshakable reference points by which one can calibrate a clock. But the moon is the wild card in the celestial deck. Its orbit isn't flat. It's tilted, and most significantly, it slowly wobbles in space, like a top spun at an angle. This full wobble cycle takes a lengthy 18 6/10 years, and the ancient observers noticed the crucial thing. The most terrifying events, eclipses, occur precisely when this oscillating lunar orbit reaches its extreme positions. All of Stonehenge's mechanics were designed to pinpoint these extreme points. Let's examine the details. The famous circle of sarsen stones isn't just a fence, it's a calibration disc. The gaps between the upright stones and the lintels, the trilithons, are not mere passageways, but precisely aligned sightlines, aiming windows. They create perfectly calibrated corridors for observation. The complex's central axis, passing through the altar stone and the famous heel stone, is aimed perfectly at the sunrise point on the summer solstice. This was the main marker, the 0 point, by which the entire system was calibrated each year. But this was merely the setup. The real work began afterward, and it involved other, now vanished or less noticeable, stones and posts. And now, a visualization of the process. Imagine the work of a priest astronomer. Step 1. Calibration. On the summer solstice, he stands in the center and observes the first ray of sun falling perfectly into the sightline over the heel stone. The system is working. The instrument is tuned. Step 2. Prolonged observation. Now his object is the moon. Every night for many years, he or his apprentices record its rising point. They see how, year after year, this point slowly shifts along the horizon. Step 3. Identifying the peak. In the 9th year of observations, the moon's rising point reaches its maximum, coinciding with one of the pre-established marker stones. That's it. The signal has been received. This is the high moon. The celestial mechanism has entered a dangerous phase. This is precisely the moment the computer delivers its verdict. The priest astronomer knew, in the coming months, when a full or new moon graced that extreme point, the chances of an eclipse soared. He couldn't pinpoint the exact date a decade in advance, but he could, with absolute certainty, map out the celestial dragon's hunting season, that temporal corridor when disaster was most likely to strike. And within that corridor, he meticulously tracked the moon's phases. If a new moon coincided with the moon's passage through that perilous point on the horizon, one could brace for trouble. The sun would be extinguished. This system was a stroke of genius in its simplicity and reliability. It required no written script or intricate mathematical tables. All information was encoded within the very geometry of the structure. Knowledge didn't need to be entrusted to fragile human memory or ephemeral media. It was carved in granite, literally set in stone. Each new generation of priests didn't have to rediscover the 18-year cycle. They simply needed to learn how to read the readings from the monumental stone instrument their ancestors had built. This wasn't mere construction, it was programming in stone. They took the seemingly chaotic motions of celestial bodies and bound them within the rigid logic of architecture. They forged a machine that operated without a single moving part, powered solely by Earth's own rotation. And this machine granted them what no other people on the planet possessed: knowledge of the future. Not prophecy, but precise, dispassionate calculation. We speak of the observer's genius, of the calculation's precision, of the project's sheer grandeur. But let's, for a moment, set aside the stars and look beneath our feet at the people. The true magnitude of this undertaking is best measured not in tons of stone, but in human lives. A humble Stonehenge builder who year after year hauled loads, his hands raw from coarse ropes, burned as many calories in a single workday as his hunter kin expended during 3 days tracking deer. The energy consumed by the entire army of builders in a single week would have been enough to feed the entire population of southern Britain for a month. This was no mere construction project. It was a metabolic explosion, an endeavor that gambled the entirety of an entire society's resources for the sake of one singular idea. And this explosion of effort would have been impossible without two unsung heroes whose names history has not preserved, yet whose genius was no less critical than that of the observer himself. The first was the Master of Stone. He didn't gaze at the heavens, he peered deep into the earth. He was a geologist, an engineer, and a sculptor, all rolled into one. With merely a tap of his stone hammer against a rock face, he could discern its internal stresses and anticipate precisely where a fissure would run. He understood how to build a fire to superheat the stone, then douse it with cold water, forcing colossal slabs to cleave off with an echoing crack. For hours, days, even weeks, he would painstakingly shape an intractable sarsen, using only harder hammerstones to give it a perfect form, complete with mortise and tenon joints that fit together with millimeter precision. Without him, the observer would have had nothing but dreams. The Master of Stone transformed those dreams into blueprints, and those blueprints into reality. The second was the Keeper of Ways. This individual never laid a hand on the stones, yet without him, not a single boulder would have budged. He was a logistical mastermind. His mission was to feed, house, organize, and crucially, motivate thousands of individuals marshaled from across the entire island. He oversaw the mapping of routes, the construction of temporary encampments, and the delivery of provisions and fresh water. He coordinated the efforts of hundreds of teams, transforming a chaotic multitude into a unified, well-oiled machine. If the observer was the operation's brain and the Master of Stone its hands, then the Keeper of Ways was its very bloodstream. It was he who ensured the project's uninterrupted supply of energy, both physical in the form of food and spiritual in the form of order and confidence. These three, the Observer, the Master of Stone, and the Keeper of Ways, formed the triumvirate that orchestrated this miracle. Their work was akin to a complex, synchronized dance. The astronomer dictated where each stone should be placed. The geologist located and prepared it, and the logistician delivered it to its site, ensuring the people had everything they needed. This was humanity's first project management office, where scientific inquiry, engineering practice, and management seamlessly merged to achieve a goal that, to their contemporaries, must have seemed utterly impossible. But what compelled thousands of ordinary people to obey them? Was it solely the fear of divine retribution? Here, we uncover a most astonishing everyday detail that grounds this entire narrative. Excavations at Durrington Walls, the enormous builders' settlement nearby, have revealed their secret. Archaeologists analyzed the bones of thousands of animals consumed during the construction. And here's the shocking truth. Most of the pigs eaten there weren't raised locally. They were driven from across all of Britain, some even from distant Scotland, hundreds of miles away. This signifies that the construction of Stonehenge wasn't merely forced labor, it was the greatest festival in the island's history. Each tribe considered it an honor to send their finest people and their best offerings for the collective endeavor. People journeyed here not just to work, but to feast, to exchange news, to forge alliances and marriages. The Keeper of Ways wasn't just feeding laborers. He was orchestrating a continuous celebration that transformed grueling toil into a sacred ritual and a matter of universal pride. So, Stonehenge stands as a monument not only to astronomical insight, but also to the social genius of its creators. They grasped a fundamental truth. To move mountains, you must give people not just orders, but a shared dream. And also, you must feed them very, very well. The bluestone prototype was complete. The mathematical model worked. Thousands of people had been gathered, fed, and inspired. It seemed nothing could halt the grand project. But precisely at this moment, as the most complex and resource-intensive phase began, the transport and erection of the colossal Sarsen trilithons, the system encountered a perfect storm. The adversary wasn't an external enemy or a natural disaster. The enemy was internal. It was a virus of doubt that began to spread faster than any epidemic. The old caste of Earth Keepers, marginalized and biding their time, patiently waited for their moment. They couldn't dispute the Observer's calculations, but they could attack his vision from another angle through superstition and fear deeply ingrained in people's minds. When one of the first multi-ton Sarsens broke loose and shattered for the engineers, it was a regrettable technical setback. But for the rival priests, it was a gift from the heavens. They immediately declared it a sign. Mother Earth rejects these foreign stones. You anger her by carving scars into her body, they whispered through the crowds. When lightning struck a tree near the camp during a storm, it was no longer mere coincidence, but a dire warning from the heavens. Every accident, every illness, every minor misfortune was now interpreted as a manifestation of divine wrath. The Earth Keepers didn't incite open rebellion. They waged the first information war in history, masterfully playing on emotions. They didn't say, "He's wrong." They said, "This is cursed." And here, the project's greatest strength became its primary vulnerability. The very incredible concentration of people that allowed megaliths to be moved transformed into an ideal breeding ground for panic. The unified, cohesive collective that the Keeper of Ways had so painstakingly built turned into a gigantic resonator of fear. Rumors and ominous prophecies swept through the camp in a matter of hours. People who, just yesterday, had been proud of their mission began to see ill omens in every shadow. Work slowed, then ground to a complete halt. People refused to approach the cursed stones. Desertion began. Tribal chiefs, who had staked everything on the Observer's project, found themselves under immense pressure. Their own warriors and kinsmen demanded an end to the sacrilege and a return to old rituals, to bloody sacrifices, to appease the enraged spirits. The observer's political capital was eroding before his very eyes. The entire grandiose vision hung by a thread. The machine was designed, resources were gathered, the technology worked. But the system's most crucial element, humanity itself, had faltered. The observer could predict the moon's movements decades in advance, but he couldn't foresee the irrational terror in the hearts of those meant to bring his dream to life in stone. And here it is, the moment of truth. The entire project teeters on the brink of collapse. The stone marvel risks forever remaining a pile of unfinished ruins, a monument to the greatest failure in history. The observer and his team faced a question more complex than any astronomical calculation. How do you make people believe in a blueprint when ancient primal dread stares them squarely in the face? But to unearth the truth, we must be intellectually honest and concede history is rarely one-dimensional. There exists another, equally compelling theory that doesn't so much contradict ours as it complements it. What if Stonehenge wasn't just an observatory, but also a hospital, a healing center where the sick and infirm from across the entire island flocked? This hypothesis emerged from the analysis of human remains found in burials around the complex. Many exhibited signs of severe injuries and illnesses, yet they were interred with the highest honors. Furthermore, folklore has preserved echoes of a belief that those very blue stones from Wales possessed magical, curative properties. Perhaps people believed that if one washed these stones with water and then washed oneself with that same water, any ailment could be cured. But whatever its primary function, a celestial shield or a prehistoric hospital, the cost of this project was truly astronomical. Let's try to translate that into understandable terms. By the most conservative estimates, the creation of Stonehenge consumed more than 30 million person-hours. This is equivalent to 1,000 people dedicating their entire adult lives, from youth to old age, to this single endeavor. And these weren't slaves. These were the best, strongest, and healthiest members of society, diverted from hunting and farming. A Stone Age society gambled its entire food security, betting it all on this project. It was the riskiest investment in history. To grasp its scale, imagine a modern nation deciding to halt all road construction for 10 years, shut down half its factories, and dispatch its most skilled engineers and laborers to build something entirely new, a gigantic scientific instrument that might, just might, save everyone from a hypothetical future catastrophe. The level of faith in the leader and in the idea itself would have to be simply off the charts. All resources that could have been spent on improving life here and now were thrown into the furnace of this grand vision. And this allows us to view the project from a completely fresh perspective, not as a whim, but as an act of desperate necessity. And this leads us to the enterprise's hidden meaning, its symbolism. The transportation of the bluestones from Wales wasn't merely a logistical operation or a test run. It was a political manifesto carved into the landscape. The Preseli Mountains, from which the stones were taken, were considered the ancestral homeland of many tribes, a place of power where ancestral spirits resided. To bring a piece of that sacred mountain to the very heart of the Salisbury Plain meant symbolically shifting the world's center, uniting the ancient wisdom of the ancestors with the observer's new scientific thought. This was an act of unification. By compelling dozens of tribes to jointly haul the sacred stones of their common ancestors along a single route, the observer was physically stitching together the patchwork quilt of disparate clans into a unified nation. Everyone who pushed a lever or pulled a rope became part of something greater than their village or kin. They became part of the people of Stonehenge. Thus, the economic cost and the symbolic significance were inextricably linked. The colossal expenditure was justified not only by future salvation from a celestial threat, but also by the immediate creation of a new, unified society. He wasn't just building an observatory, he was building a new identity. And the currency in this construction wasn't money, but shared labor and shared belief. And now, having explored the ingenious astronomical machine, the incredible logistical feat, and the fierce ideological struggle. All the scattered threads of our story finally weave together into a cohesive tapestry. The picture becomes clear, and we are poised to answer the pivotal question: what was the true genius behind Stonehenge's creators? What allowed them to achieve this marvel, which even today seems an impossibility? Let us return to our starting point. Society was gripped by a profound existential crisis. The old worldview, rooted in the worship of earth spirits, had crumbled. It could no longer explain why the world seemed to have spun out of control, nor could it offer any solace. People found themselves alone, confronting a hostile and unpredictable universe. They didn't just need a new deity. They needed a whole new operating system for consciousness itself. And here lies the revelation. The phenomenon of Stonehenge is that it wasn't merely one thing. It wasn't solely an observatory, or simply a temple, or merely a power spot. Its genius lay in synthesis. It was humanity's first complex system for managing reality, operating simultaneously on three levels: intellectual, emotional, and social. On an intellectual level, it provided what the old priests could not: explanation. A cold, mathematically precise understanding of celestial cycles transformed terrifying chaos into a predictable mechanism. It didn't eliminate the fear of an eclipse, but it replaced the irrational terror of the unknown with concrete knowledge of a coming event. This gave the elite, the tribal leaders, the most valuable commodity: time to prepare. On an emotional level, this system offered not just an explanation, but a magnificent spectacle. The construction process itself, the colossal stones, the perfectly aligned lines, all of it inspired profound awe. Then, on the day of a predicted eclipse, as the priest-astronomer performed the ritual and seemingly brought back the sun, a true miracle unfolded. The system didn't just forecast the event, it conquered it before the eyes of the entire populace. It transformed passive victims of the cosmos into active participants in its drama, granting them the illusion of control and an incredible sense of security. Finally, on a social level, the entire project, from quarrying the stones to the final celebratory feast, served as an immensely powerful unifying tool. It compelled thousands of people from diverse tribes to recognize themselves as a single people, united in the face of a common threat and bound by a shared grand objective. Stonehenge transcended being merely the center of their world. It became the physical embodiment of their collective will and identity. It was a symbol, carved in stone, of their new covenant. So, what then is the secret behind the observer and his team? They weren't merely scientists, they were brilliant social engineers. They grasped a fundamental law of power. To govern people facing chaos, you must provide them three things: a clear worldview, a ritual allowing interaction with that world, and a shared dream compelling them forward. Stonehenge was the perfect solution, satisfying all three conditions. It was a machine for generating order from chaos. And once we grasp this, the sheer scale of the vision truly begins to astound us. This was no longer merely construction. It was an audacious attempt to reprogram human consciousness, to alter the very foundations of society, to forge a new covenant between humanity and the universe. A design of titanic, almost divine proportions, realized by people who possessed nothing but their intellect, their will, and stone. The triumph of the observers and the completion of Stonehenge ignited a chain reaction whose echoes resonate even into our present day. They didn't just establish a precedent, they forged a new paradigm of power. For the first time in history, a ruler's authority wasn't founded on birthright or brute force, but on the possession of exclusive knowledge. The priest-astronomer, capable of predicting the will of the heavens, became more influential than a chieftain commanding the largest band of warriors. This idea, that knowledge is power, became a cultural gene that, surviving through millennia, sprouted in ancient Greece, took root during the Renaissance, and blossomed in the era of the scientific revolution. Every scientist, every engineer, every analyst predicting currency fluctuations or asteroid trajectories is a distant descendant of that initial observer who proved the future isn't merely to be awaited, it can be calculated. And we use its legacy literally every single day, often without even realizing it. First, consider architecture. The ingenious and simple solution devised by the builders of Stonehenge, the mortise and tenon joint system, with horizontal lintels resting on two vertical supports, became the alpha and omega of all monumental construction. Every time you see a portico with columns on a classical building, from the Parthenon to the Metropolitan Opera House, you are witnessing a direct descendant of the engineering brilliance born on Salisbury Plain. They were the first to learn how to build with stone, not simply stack it. Second, there is the very idea of sacred geometry. Stonehenge wasn't merely a structure, it was the nexus of a meticulously planned ritualistic landscape where every hill, every trench, every road was aligned with celestial bodies. This concept, that architecture should be inscribed within the cosmos, reflecting its harmony, endures to this day. It underpins the layout of magnificent temple complexes from Angkor Wat to the Vatican City, and even informs the principles of modern landscape design. We still intuitively sense that a building constructed in harmony with its surroundings possesses a special power. But most astonishing is the paradox of its legacy. The original idea behind Stonehenge was, at its core, deeply scientific. It was an attempt to replace irrational fear of chaos with rational knowledge of order. It was a triumph of logic over superstition. However, over time, as catastrophic eclipses became rare occurrences and new generations of priests lost the key to the complex calculations, the true purpose of the complex was forgotten. The instruction manual had gone missing. And then, something incredible happened. The very machine built to slay superstition itself transformed into the greatest object of superstition. Rituals that were initially just vivid demonstrations of scientific prediction became ends in themselves. The sophisticated astronomical model degenerated into a primitive calendar and a site for sun worship. Thousands of years later, druids arrived, followed by modern mystics who perceived everything from gateways to other worlds to Atlantean power spots to altars for magical rites in these stones. Everything, that is, except what it truly was, the most sophisticated scientific instrument of the pre-literate age. The greatest achievement of Stone Age rational thought ultimately became the chief symbol of mysticism and irrational belief. Thus, in a twist of history, a grand idea morphed into its complete opposite. 4,500 years ago, a small society, confronted by a threat it couldn't fully comprehend, did the unthinkable. It gambled its entire present for the sake of the future. It mobilized all its resources to construct a machine for predicting catastrophes. Now, let's look at ourselves. We live in a world drowning in information. We possess satellites, supercomputers, and predictive models of incredible complexity. We know about the approaching climate crisis, the risk of new pandemics, the depletion of resources. Yet what do? We argue, we doubt, we procrastinate. The parallel between our time and the era of Stonehenge is simply deafening in its precision. We too have our observers, scientists who have been sounding the alarm for decades, providing graphs and calculations. And we too have our keepers of the earth, powerful forces whose well-being is predicated on maintaining the old order. They tell us that change is too costly, that science isn't omnipotent, that it's better to trust the familiar rituals of market economics and political cycles. We, like our distant ancestors, stand at a crossroads between inconvenient truth and comforting lies. So, what is the main, non-trivial lesson of this ancient story? It isn't merely that we should listen to scientists. That's too simplistic. The true lesson of Stonehenge runs far deeper. The observer didn't succeed because his mathematics were correct. He succeeded because he managed to transform a scientific project into a national dream. He didn't just show people calculations. He gave them a cause that united them. He clothed the cold logic of astronomy in the warm, emotional embrace of shared ritual, shared labor, and shared celebration. And here it is, the crystallization of the lesson for us. To grapple with the existential threats of the 21st century, scientific data alone simply won't suffice. Graphs and reports do not shift the consciousness of the masses. We need our own Stonehenge. We need a grand, unifying project that is not only technologically sophisticated, but also mythologically potent. One that appeals not just to our intellect, but to our hearts. The transition to green energy must become more than an economic necessity. It must be the great building project of the century, a source of national pride. Creating a global healthcare system must not be merely a line item in a budget, but a symbol of our shared humanity. And so, in drawing a preliminary conclusion, we arrive at an idea both inspiring and daunting. The creators of Stonehenge looked out at an alien, cold, and indifferent cosmos, seeking to shield themselves from its whims. We, however, stare at the chaos we ourselves have wrought on our own planet. Their threat came from without. Ours grows from within. They constructed their celestial shield from stone because it was the most durable material they knew. What material should our shield be built from? Likely something far more intricate and fragile. Global trust, political will, and the capacity of our generation to begin building what only our grandchildren will fully appreciate. The story of Stonehenge is not merely a tale of the past. It is a blueprint for how a society standing on the precipice can save itself. Let us for a moment commit an intellectual sacrilege and view this story through the eyes of the adversary. We called them the caste of the Earth Keepers, but to themselves they were simply priests, guardians of the ancient order. And to understand them, we must discard the caricatured image of reactionaries clinging to power. They were representatives of a complex, self-sufficient, and incredibly ancient civilization, whose wisdom was inscribed not in stone, but in the landscape itself. Their world was alive. Every hill had its name and character, every river its will, every stone its memory. The universe for them was not a mechanism, but an endless conversation of spirits, and their task was to be sensitive interpreters in that dialogue. Their logic was impeccable within the framework of their worldview. They believed that the world was a fragile balance, maintained by rituals refined over centuries. Their strength lay not in prediction, but in harmonization. They did not try to calculate the future, they tried to negotiate with the present. When a drought began, they knew which stream spirit to appeal to. When livestock fell ill, they knew in which sacred grove to make an offering. And for centuries it worked. Their system gave people a sense of security and belonging to a living, breathing world. Now, imagine how wild, incomprehensible, and even insane the builders of Stonehenge must have seemed to them. In their eyes, these were not geniuses, but barbarians of a new kind. Barbarians armed not with a club, but with hubris. These people arrived and stopped listening to the earth. Instead, they began to carve it up, tearing giant pieces from its body, dragging them along, leaving behind ugly scars of roads and camps. They created unimaginable noise, drowning out the whisper of the spirits with the roar of their stone hammers. They were deaf to the world. What was the cultural shock for the Earth Keepers? It was in the very approach. The observer and his team weren't trying to converse with the universe. They were trying to interrogate it, hack it, bend it to their will. They looked at the sky not with reverence, but with the cold, calculating curiosity of a surgeon dissecting a patient on the operating table. The very notion that a living, breathing, thinking sky could be reduced to a mere collection of predictable cycles struck them as a monstrous oversimplification, an act of supreme arrogance. To them, this wasn't science, it was black magic, an audacious attempt to pilfer power directly from the gods themselves. To them, Stonehenge wasn't a celestial shield, it was a needle, a weapon that madmen were trying to plunge into the very heart of the world. They weren't merely afraid of losing power. They genuinely believed that these arrogant upstarts, with their blasphemous acts, would unleash a catastrophe so immense that any eclipse would pale in comparison, seeming like a child's tantrum. Their fear wasn't the fear of a conservative recoiling from progress. It was the visceral terror of a living creature facing vivisection. And therein lay their tragedy, the tragedy of predictability. All their strength was rooted in tradition, in treading the well-worn paths of their ancestors. They were powerful as long as the world played by familiar rules. But they were utterly unprepared for an entirely new paradigm of thought. They tried to combat a mathematical model with incantations and rituals. They sought ill omens where their opponents saw only engineering miscalculations. Their greatest strength, a deep, unshakable faith in the established order of things, became their Achilles' heel. Their reactions were tragically predictable. They couldn't even fathom that someone would dare not just bend the rules of the game, but start playing an entirely different one with their own self-invented regulations. They were the guardians of a world that was dying before their very eyes, and they couldn't even find the words to describe the force that was killing it. When the project stalled, paralyzed by fear and rampant rumors, the observer faced the most terrifying choice of his life. His mathematics were impeccable, his blueprints flawless, but he was losing the war for people's souls. He could either concede defeat and allow his grand vision to crumble into ruin, or he could become the very thing he was fighting against. And he made his choice. He resolved to conquer superstition with an even greater superstition. He decided to offer a sacrifice, not to the gods he didn't believe in, but to the monumental goal that had utterly consumed him. He didn't just need a scapegoat, he needed a symbol, and he found it in the very heart of his team. It was the Keeper of Paths, his loyal comrade, a logistical genius, a man who could feed and organize an army. But in the observer's eyes, he had one fatal flaw. He understood people too well. He saw their fear and advised slowing down, talking to them, reassuring them. He proposed showing empathy. Yet, in the observer's equation, empathy was a variable that led directly to failure. And then came the accusation, monstrous in its falsehood. The observer publicly declared that all the accidents and ill omens were the work of a saboteur, one who had conspired with the spirits of the earth. And that saboteur was named the Keeper of Paths. It was a stroke of genius and utterly diabolical. He didn't just eliminate an opponent, he appropriated the enemy's very language. He orchestrated a public trial that was nothing short of a perfectly staged ritual. He weaponized all the crowd's fears against a single man. And when the Keeper of Paths was executed, perhaps ritually cast down from one of the unfinished trilithons, it was presented not as a punishment, but as a grand, cleansing sacrifice that appeased the enraged earth and lifted the curse from the stones. And it worked. The crowd, having received their sacrifice and witnessed their miracle, returned to work with renewed fervor. The project was saved. But that day, the idealist died. The man who had sought to replace fear with knowledge himself became a fount of dread. The burden of that decision changed him forever. He had achieved his objective, yet remained utterly alone at the pinnacle of his genius. He could no longer trust anyone. He saw people not as collaborators, but merely as instruments, cogs in his magnificent machine. His gaze grew colder, his commands harsher. He had saved his people from a celestial threat, but he himself transformed into an earthly, inscrutable, and terrifying deity to them. He had won the war for the future, but lost the battle for his own soul. The price of genius is always high, but it's not only the geniuses who pay it. The primary sacrifice on the altar of Stonehenge wasn't the observer himself, but the friend he betrayed. The Keeper of Paths was no traitor. He was a humanist in an inhumane age. He believed that a noble goal could not be built upon bones and deceit. His tragedy was that his common sense and compassion were perceived as a threat. His name was erased from history, his contributions forgotten. And now, gazing upon the majestic stones, we must remember, they stand not solely on a foundation of chalk and granite. They rest upon the bedrock of one grand dream and one grand betrayal. And the shadow they cast on the summer solstice is the shadow not just of stone, but of a man sacrificed for the sake of progress. When the new power of the observers was solidified, the most complex and painful process began, the clash of two civilizations within the consciousness of one people. This was no smooth synthesis. Initially, it was a harsh, irreconcilable conflict, unfolding not on a battlefield, but in the rhythm of daily life. The old world of the Earthkeepers was a realm of intimate spaces and tangible sacred sites. Holy was the specific stream behind the village, the ancient oak on the hill, the oddly shaped stone at the crossroads. The architecture of the old world was the architecture of nature. The divine was to be discovered, not constructed. The new world of Stonehenge brought with it the idea of a man-made sacred center. It negated the sanctity of small places in favor of one colossal, universal shrine. Why pray to the spirit of a stream when one could become part of a ritual that governed the movement of the moon? This was a conflict between the local and the global, between nature and geometry. The old world was analog, warm, and intuitive. The new, digital, cold, and calculated. And at first, they could not coexist. Adherents of the old faith, going to pray at their traditional stones, now appeared as dangerous dissidents, defying the new order. But completely eradicating millennia-old beliefs was impossible. And so, as always happens throughout history, a process began not of destruction, but of absorption. The new ideology, to survive, was forced to mimic, incorporating elements of the old, creating astonishing cultural hybrids. This process was akin to how early Christianity assimilated pagan holidays, transforming the winter solstice into Christmas. The observers, being brilliant pragmatists, understood that people needed not only reason, but also magic. The most striking hybrid is the blue stones themselves. Why did the observer need to drag them 250 kilometers from Wales? From an astronomical perspective, any stone of the right shape would have worked just as well. The answer is simple. He used the magic of the old world as fuel for his new machine. The Preseli Mountains were already a sacred place for the Earthkeepers. These stones were already considered healing and alive. By taking them, the observer performed an act of symbolic appropriation. It was as if he was saying, "Your ancient earth magic will now serve our new sky science. We do not deny your power. We put it at the service of a higher order." The same thing happened with rituals. The grand ceremonies at Stonehenge weren't just lectures on astronomy. They included elements of old agrarian festivals, songs, dances, and feasts. But now, all of this was subordinated to a new logic. People could still ask the earth for fertility, but only after the priest-astronomer confirmed that the celestial order was undisturbed. Old beliefs weren't abolished. They were demoted, transformed from a standalone religion into folklore, a colorful supplement to the main scientific ritual. We see echoes of this in the famous grooved pottery of that era. Its geometric patterns were perhaps not just ornamentation, but a mass replication of the sacred symbols of the new cosmic order. How did this change the life of the average person? Fundamentally. First, the very perception of time changed. Previously, life flowed in a short, annual cycle, planting, harvesting, wintering. Now, the entire society lived to the rhythm of a gigantic, nearly 19-year lunar cycle. There emerged a sense of grand history, of long-term planning. Your father began dragging this stone, you continue, and your son will finish it. Second, geography changed. The center of the world became not your village, but Stonehenge. Once a year, you embarked on this magnificent pilgrimage, which was simultaneously a labor duty and the biggest festival of your life. Old habits faded away. Instead of consulting a local shaman, people brought their problems to the ritual center. New habits emerged. A person's status was now determined not just by their prowess in hunting, but by their role in the grand project. Being a master stoneworker became more prestigious than being the best tracker. Imperceptibly, humanity ceased to be merely a child of nature. It became a citizen of the world's first technocratic empire, built around a single scientific instrument. The observer was a genius, not only in astronomy, but also in what we would today call public relations. He instinctively understood that naked truth and precise calculations could not rally thousands of people. People needed a legend, and he purposefully, step by step, constructed his own myth. He never said, "I calculated." He said, "The sky told me." His simple sighting devices of wood and stone, in the eyes of the crowd, became sacred artifacts, tools for direct dialogue with the gods. Rumors spread around him, which he himself likely encouraged, that he didn't sleep like ordinary mortals, but that his spirit journeyed along lunar paths, that he understood the language of the stars, that he was a descendant of the Sky Man himself. He transformed science into a mystery, and himself from a scholar into a prophet. This was not merely megalomania, but a cold, pragmatic calculation. A deified leader is beyond criticism. His word is law. In response, the Earthkeepers launched a powerful counter-propaganda campaign, a veritable Stone Age black PR effort. They couldn't dispute his predictions, so they attacked his character and methods. They crafted an image of the observer as a cold, soulless being, a man without a shadow who, in pursuit of celestial secrets, had lost touch with the living earth. They whispered that he didn't hear the groans of the earth as his tools bit into it, that he was deaf to the cries of the spirits whose homes were destroyed. The main myth they propagated was even more terrifying. The observer wasn't predicting the arrival of a celestial dragon devouring the sun. He was summoning it himself. His grandiose structure wasn't a shield, but a beacon, attracting the monster. He was a sorcerer who had made a pact with the forces of darkness for power. And what's most striking is that one of these myths has survived to this day, mutated and transformed. The idea that Stonehenge was a place of grim, bloody rituals, where sinister priests offered human sacrifices, is a direct echo of that ancient propaganda. The Earthkeepers lost the war, but their primary meme, their dark legend of the builders' cruelty and sacrilege, proved incredibly resilient. It outlived its creators by thousands of years, eventually to be picked up by 19th century romantics and transformed into a popular stereotype. But the principle that history is written by the victors is best illustrated by the execution of the Keeper of Paths. The official version, passed down orally by the new caste of priest astronomers, was simple and heroic. A cunning saboteur, an agent of chaos, was discovered attempting to destroy the great work. He was exposed, and his just execution became an act of purification, lifting the curse from the stones and allowing the work to be completed. In this narrative, the observer was the hero who saved everyone from an internal enemy. Yet, archaeology, coupled with plain logic, paints an entirely different picture. Most likely, the Keeper of the Paths wasn't a traitor at all, but rather the head of a moderate opposition. He witnessed the project draining vital resources and saw people pushed to their absolute limits, urging a more cautious approach. The sabotage he was accused of was, in all likelihood, nothing more than routine engineering mishaps and delays, the very issues he had warned about, stemming from haste and sheer exhaustion. He wasn't an agent of chaos, he was a voice of reason. But the observer couldn't afford the luxury of internal dissent. What he needed was unity, forged in the crucible of fear and unwavering belief. And so, with a stroke of genius, he masterfully reframed the narrative. He took the political assassination of his chief rival and transformed it into a sacred ritual, the foundational myth of his nascent order. He didn't merely eliminate a competitor. Instead, he weaponized his death as the most potent propaganda tool imaginable, demonstrating to everyone that any obstacle on the path to their grand objective would be utterly obliterated, if not by the will of the people, then by the will of the heavens, which he now claimed to represent alone. The great day arrived and passed. The sun vanished and then gloriously returned, precisely at the predicted hour. The populace, engulfed in a torrent of terror and awe, fell to their knees before the astronomer priests. The victory was complete and absolute. Yet, it was in this very moment of triumph that the seed of a fatal poison was sown, one that would ultimately doom everything. The celestial threat had passed, and the observer now faced a new, far more daunting question. How to retain power once the enemy was vanquished? How to maintain national unity when the common objective had been achieved? It was then that a fateful decision was made, one that would irrevocably warp the entire original vision. Knowledge ceased to be a shield for all. It became a weapon for the chosen few. This pivotal shift triggered a profound schism at the very heart of the new elite. Opposing this novel doctrine was the one least expected, the Master of Stone. An engineer, a geologist, a man who felt stone as if it were a living entity. He was an idealist, convinced they were building not just a machine, but a powerful symbol of a new, enlightened world. He perceived harmony in the lines and proportions of Stonehenge, believing this harmony should belong to everyone, not merely a select priestly circle. He contended that their mission wasn't simply to predict eclipses, but to teach humanity to understand the language of the heavens, freeing them from the shackles of fear forever. He approached the observer with a concrete, actionable plan. He proposed establishing mini Stonehenges, simplified yet functional calendar observatories in every major village. He aimed to train local elders in the rudiments of astronomy, envisioning knowledge spreading across the land, becoming an integral part of daily life. He sought to democratize the marvel. To him, this represented the logical culmination of their magnificent endeavor. But he was met with an icy, impenetrable wall. The observer, no longer a visionary dreamer, but now a supreme ruler, perceived a mortal threat in this proposition. To grant them knowledge is to surrender control, he retorted. They are not ready. They are but children who require a paternal hand, not complex formulae. Our task is not to explain, but to guide. Our power lies in secrecy. The clash between the two former allies was a conflict of two irreconcilable worlds. The Master of Stone cried out, "We promised them light, and you offer a new, far more insidious darkness." The observer responded with chilling calm, "I offer order. Your light will bring nothing but anarchy and endless strife." It was the eternal dispute between the Enlightener and the Grand Inquisitor. And so, the Master of Stone committed an act of audacious desperation. He began, in absolute secrecy, to carve simplified diagrams of the moon's movements onto small, solitary stones scattered around Stonehenge, an alphabet of the heavens, intelligible even to the uneducated. It was his manifesto, his defiant attempt to shatter the monopoly on knowledge. The denouement was swift and brutal. The observer ordered these heretical stones to be found and annihilated. But this was no mere command to dispose of them. It was a public, symbolic act of crushing retribution. Before the eyes of the gathered, awe-struck crowds, the temple guard wielded stone hammers, smashing these primitive etchings into dust. The deafening clang of stone against stone sounded like a death knell for the original vision. In that moment, a grand scientific endeavor irrevocably devolved into a religious dictatorship. The very system created to combat ignorance had now made ignorance its primary instrument. It was the second, and this time final, point of no return. The triumph of the new ideology completely rewired the social fabric of the island. At the apex of this new pyramid of power now stood a closed caste of astronomer priests led by the aging observer. They were the very brain and soul of this brave new world. A rung below them were the tribal chiefs who had shrewdly aligned themselves with the ascendant power. These once independent rulers were transformed into regional governors, their authority now entirely dependent on the goodwill of the high priest. Their primary duties revolved around tribute collection and maintaining local order. And what of the old elite, the keepers of the earth? They were utterly erased. Their sacred groves were razed, their standing stones, the very menhirs they venerated, were toppled and shattered. The keepers themselves were either executed as agents of chaos or at best assimilated, relegated to the role of village shamans, permitted to conduct only minor, everyday rituals that dared not presume to explain the cosmos. Society had ceased to be a network of equal clans. It had become a rigid, centralized hierarchy. The victors gained not only power, but also unprecedented wealth. The grand festival that had united the people during Stonehenge's construction was over. Now, the flow of resources moved in only one direction, toward the center. A system, best described as a temple tax, was instituted. Every community was obligated to deliver the finest portions of its harvest, livestock, and artisanal goods to Stonehenge. What had once been a voluntary contribution to a shared endeavor became a mandatory tribute. These colossal resources were not funneled into new monumental projects, but rather into sustaining the burgeoning priestly apparatus, the temple guard, and the staging of increasingly lavish and costly ceremonies designed to showcase the new regime's might. The economy was entirely rebuilt upon the skeletal framework of the Great Construction Project. The logistical routes, originally carved out for transporting stones and provisions, did not vanish. Instead, they transformed into permanent state roads, the lifeblood arteries of a new empire, through which tribute flowed continuously to the center. Stonehenge, once a construction site, became the capital, the primary economic and distribution hub. Regional centers of power that had thrived previously now withered. Why transport goods to a local market when the most valuable items still had to be sent to Stonehenge anyway? The entire economic life of the island now revolved around a single point on the map. This marked Britain's first total centralization in history. In the initial years following the grand event, society experienced a collective euphoria. They had survived. They had been saved. They were the chosen people, safeguarded by the wisest and most all-knowing rulers. This sense of security was so profound that people joyfully relinquished their former chaotic freedoms in exchange for predictability and order. They willingly surrendered their agency to those who had proven capable of even governing the movement of the sun. It was the honeymoon period of the new order, a time of absolute trust and unquestioning obedience. But as time wore on, this euphoria gradually gave way to a pervasive collective apathy. The world, which had once been brimming with mysteries and demanded that every individual be observant, resourceful, and courageous, suddenly became utterly simple and comprehensible. All the major questions had already been answered. What would tomorrow bring? Ask a priest. Why did the harvest fail? The priest would explain. People's worldview narrowed dramatically. The primal fear of nature's chaos was replaced by a quiet, everyday fear of authority. People stopped asking questions. They learned to dread giving the wrong answers. Their consciousness, once wild and boundless like the plains around them, found itself confined within the tight circle of the new Dogma's stone trilithons. Thus, the very self-perception of humankind shifted. No longer an active participant in a dialogue with the universe, they became a passive spectator in a drama orchestrated by the priests. Their world bifurcated into two distinct realms: the inscrutable, divine world of the heavens, accessible only to the chosen few, and the profane, earthly world where their sole tasks were to toil and to obey. It was a society that had achieved incredible stability. But the price of this stability was the death of curiosity. Behind every grand endeavor lies a grand idea. Stonehenge is no exception. To truly grasp its essence, we must descend from the scaffolds of engineering marvel to the deepest philosophical bedrock upon which this stone wonder was erected. The central concept that guided the observer and his followers was revolutionary and utterly heretical for its era. Let's call it the philosophy of the unchanging rhythm. It posited that the universe was not a collection of capricious spirits, but a single, magnificent, and knowable mechanism. Within it, there was no chaos, only an order we had not yet comprehended. The sun, moon, stars, tides, the changing seasons, all were not manifestations of divine will, but the cogs and gears of a colossal clockwork. And the task of the wise was not to worship this mechanism, but to study it, understand its rhythm, and learn to live in harmony with it. The intellectual engine, the shadowy mastermind of this revolution, wasn't the observer himself. He was merely the brilliant executor. The true author of the idea was his long-deceased teacher, whom we might call the first seer. This man was a recluse, an outcast, someone who first dared the unthinkable. He stopped seeing the face of a god in the sky and instead discerned a clock face. For decades, in complete solitude, he conducted his observations, not attempting to build anything, but merely imprinting into memory the slightest deviations in the celestial dance. He was the first to hypothesize the existence of a gigantic, hidden cycle that governed everything. He imparted his dangerous, subversive ideas to only one, his most capable student, our observer, bequeathing to him not just a continuation of observations, but a mandate to find a way to make this knowledge eternal, to carve it in stone so that it might never again be lost. The first seer gave his student not merely an idea, he gave him a method of patient, systematic, almost meditative observation that was to span not years, but generations. He taught that truth does not arrive as a sudden epiphany or a prophetic dream. Truth is a harvest that slowly ripens in the field of accumulated data. It was he who first understood that human memory was too short and unreliable for such a monumental task. A medium for information was needed that would neither age nor lie. Stone was required. Thus, the entire titanic construction of Stonehenge was, in essence, the fulfillment of a philosophical testament. The observer was not simply building an observatory, he was building an eternal archive for his teacher's knowledge. This cold, rational doctrine of the unchanging rhythm was countered by another, equally cohesive and beautiful philosophy. The philosophy of the living whisper, espoused by the keepers of the earth. They too believed in a unified world, but for them it was not a mechanism, but an organism, a living, breathing, sentient entity. They believed the universe constantly spoke to humankind, but not in the language of mathematics. Rather, it spoke in whispers, the rustling of leaves, the behavior of animals, the shape of clouds, the flow of water. And the task of the wise was not to measure, but to listen, to cultivate not intellect, but intuition, and empathy for the world. Their sacred places were not man-made, they were discovered. Their knowledge was not calculated, it was felt. The struggle for Stonehenge was not merely a power struggle, it was a grand debate of ideas that would shape the future of European civilization. The philosophy of rhythm demanded that humans distance themselves from the world to study it objectively. It demanded looking upward at the cold, distant stars. The philosophy of whisper, conversely, demanded maximum immersion in the world, a fusion with it. It demanded looking downward at the earth beneath one's feet, at the grass and stones. One doctrine birthed astronomy, engineering, and mathematics. The other, poetry, mysticism, and what we would today call ecological consciousness. The triumph of the unchanging rhythm heralded reason's victory over raw intuition. It bestowed upon humanity an incredible tool for understanding and shaping the world. Yet, it also planted the seeds of our profound alienation from nature. The day humanity declared the world a mere machine, it inadvertently crowned itself its mechanic. This was the genesis of a path that led us both to soaring among the stars and to the precipice of a global ecological crisis. Grand systems, forged by the genius of a singular mind, almost invariably carry within them the seeds of their own demise. And the Stonehenge system proved no exception. The moment the observer, ancient and transmuted into a living myth, breathed his last, the colossal machine, stripped of its principal operator, began to falter. On the surface, all appeared unchanged. Priests performed their rites, the populace brought offerings, the stones stood immutable. But this was merely a facade. The central gyroscope that held the entire edifice in equilibrium, the living, inquisitive mind of its founder, had ceased to turn. The system began to devour itself from within. There was no external enemy, no uprisings, only the relentless march of entropy, corroding order like rust, remained. Immediately following the lavish funeral, an ugly and inevitable struggle for succession commenced. The observer's two principal disciples, his two closest confidants, became mortal adversaries. The first, let us call him the keeper of ritual, was a dogmatist. He believed salvation lay in literal adherence to the teacher's tenets, down to the last comma. He transformed living knowledge into a dead liturgy, demanding the meticulous execution of hundreds of minor rites whose meaning had long since been lost to all. Any deviation he deemed sacrilege. The second, the voice of the people, was a pragmatist and a populist. He saw that the populace had grown weary of strict dogma, believing that to retain power, one must offer more spectacles, more festivities, more comprehensible and accessible magic. He was prepared to sacrifice the precision of calculations for the theatricality of ceremonies. Their struggle tore the grand idea to shreds, like a pack of hyenas dismembering a lion's carcass. The keeper of ritual accused his opponent of heresy and pandering to the rabble. The voice of the people, in turn, charged him with dry, soulless scholasticism that alienated people and angered the gods. Their dispute was not about the workings of the world, it was about how to control it. The great stone computer, fashioned for dialogue with the cosmos, devolved into an arena for their personal ambitions. They wielded knowledge not for prophecy, but for intrigue, manipulating observational data to buttress their own claims or discredit a rival. Yet, as they grappled for power, in the shadows, far from Stonehenge, the last embers of a true flame still flickered. This was a clandestine school, founded by the disciples of the very stone master who had once sought to democratize knowledge. From generation to generation, they secretly passed down not merely rituals, but the method itself, the method of observation, skepticism, and verification. They erected no colossal monuments. They inscribed records on bark scraps, charted celestial maps on cured hides, and crafted simple yet precise measuring instruments from wood. They were the final custodians of the heretical notion that the sky belonged to everyone. Their moment arrived when one of the school's pupils, a young and naive idealist, resolved that he could reconcile the warring factions of priests by reminding them of the first seer's true doctrine. He journeyed to Stonehenge and presented his calculations, which demonstrated that both high priests, in their disputes, had strayed from the truth. The reaction was entirely predictable. For the first time in many years, the keeper of ritual and the voice of the people discovered a common ground, a shared mortal enemy. The very existence of this school undermined the bedrock of their power, proving them both mere impostors who had lost the key to true knowledge. A raid was mounted on the school's secret sanctuary, and so the curtain fell. The last bearer of the true idea, a grey-haired elder and head of the clandestine school, was publicly immolated in the center of Stonehenge's stone circle, along with all their records and blueprints. The smoke from that pyre served as a funeral shroud for an entire epoch. On that day, The system did not merely break. It committed intellectual suicide, extinguishing the last flicker of living thought within its own confines. The grand dream of knowledge, once meant to safeguard humanity, culminated in the triumph of ignorance, which merely protected the power of the priests. The age of observers had, at last, truly ended. As the smoke from that final pyre dissipated over the plains, began the longest and darkest chapter in Stonehenge's history, an era of profound amnesia. The colossal stone edifice, stripped of its intellectual heart, fell silent. New generations of priests, failing to grasp the intricate celestial mechanics, reduced all rituals to a primitive cult of the sun and the dead. The 18-year lunar cycle, the very key to the entire system, was forgotten. Only its most basic and evident function remained, marking the days of the solstices. The grand scientific instrument devolved into a simple agrarian calendar, and then, ultimately, into an inscrutable, albeit awe-inspiring, monument to ancestors. Centuries passed. New peoples arrived on the island, bringing their own gods and tongues. They gazed upon the colossal stones with superstitious dread, yet possessed not the faintest inkling of their creator's original intent. True knowledge didn't merely become distorted. It evaporated, leaving behind not even a whisper of legend. The first rediscovery of Stonehenge occurred only 3.5 millennia later, in the 17th century, and it was a classic case of brilliant misinterpretation. Antiquarians John Aubrey and later William Stukeley, driven by the ambition to unearth a civilization in Britain comparable to the Greeks and Romans, confronted a profound enigma. Who could have erected this marvel? Lacking any substantial data, they turned to the sole source they deemed authoritative, Julius Caesar's accounts of the druid priests. And they executed a colossal intellectual leap, which, regrettably, proved to be a plunge into the abyss of misconception. They declared Stonehenge a druid temple. This notion was incredibly beautiful and romantic. It granted the British their very own antiquity, complete with white-robed philosophers performing arcane rituals amidst the megaliths. This myth proved so potent that it utterly captivated public imagination for the subsequent 300 years. Then, in the mid-20th century, science delivered a devastating blow to this enchanting fable. Radiocarbon dating emerged, and the very first samples, extracted from the base of the stones, had the impact of a bombshell. The results were unequivocal. Stonehenge had been erected 2,000 years before the first druids ever set foot on those lands. This marked one of the greatest letdowns in the annals of archaeology. Britain's quintessential symbol of antiquity was, overnight, rendered an orphan. If not the druids, then who? The myth collapsed, leaving behind only a gaping void and an even more pressing question. Why did an unnamed people of the Stone Age invest such titanic effort into this structure? And it was here, in the 1960s, that a second, and this time authentic, rebirth occurred. Astronomer Gerald Hawkins achieved something no one before him had even conceived. He reasoned that if Stonehenge was indeed a machine, it could be tested by another machine. He input the precise coordinates of all the stones into the memory of one of the world's very first IBM computers and had it calculate every conceivable astronomical alignment. The result stunned the scientific community. The computer revealed dozens of highly accurate correlations, not only with the sunrise and sunset points, but also with the extreme positions of the moon. Hawkins published his book, Stonehenge Decoded, wherein he first put forth the audacious hypothesis. This was no mere observatory, but an incredibly complex analog computer designed for eclipse prediction. The observer's legacy had been found and resurrected. Since then, each new technological advancement has afforded us an increasingly clearer reading of the stone code. Laser scanning of the terrain and ground-penetrating radar have allowed us to peer beneath the surface, revealing hundreds of long-vanished post holes from wooden uprights, which were an integral component of the computational system. We have been able to create a complete digital model of the complex and run simulations, witnessing precisely how the sighting devices and alignment markers functioned. We have, in essence, unearthed a lost owner's manual, inscribed not on paper, but upon the very body of the planet itself. And with every subsequent discovery, we find ourselves increasingly astonished, not merely by the engineering prowess, but by the sheer intellectual genius of these people. But there's a profound irony woven into this tale of rediscovery. Each epoch read Stonehenge through its own lens, imbuing it with the meaning it sought to find. 18th century antiquarians searched for a British Rome and found a druid temple. Romantic poets sought the mysterious and the unfathomable and beheld a gateway to the spirit world. Contemporary New Age seekers look for power spots and discover intersections of energy lines at Stonehenge. We, children of the digital age, seek the origins of technology, and we uncover an ancient computer. Each interpretation is a mirror, reflecting not so much the past as it does ourselves. And this leads to the ultimate question: have we truly, finally grasped their original intent? Or are we simply, once again, projecting the obsessions of our own time onto these eternal stones? And so, traversing 4.5 millennia, through triumph and tragedy, through oblivion and rediscovery, we return to where we began. We stand before the same stones, yet we see them with different eyes. We embarked on this investigation with a society paralyzed by fear of an unpredictable sky. Today, armed with supercomputers and satellites, we have finally cracked their code. We have understood their design. We have marveled at their genius. It seems we have won. We have solved their riddle. But precisely at this moment of triumph, history comes full circle and gazes directly back at us. The ancient dread of celestial chaos has been supplanted by a new, far more insidious fear: the chaos of our own man-made systems. Climate, economy, information flows, these are our new, unpredictable skies. We have the data, we have the calculations, we have our own observer scientists warning of impending eclipses. But we, much like our distant ancestors, are torn between inconvenient truth and comforting rituals. The cycle closes. And this brings us to the central, insoluble paradox of this entire grandiose saga. It is that the quest for absolute order inevitably spawns the most sophisticated chaos. The system, engineered as a celestial shield, as a guarantor of security and predictability, functioned flawlessly. It united the people, instilled in them a sense of protection and faith in the future. Yet, it was this very perfect operation that became its undoing. Having achieved absolute status, the system ceased to require inquisitive minds and calcified into dogma. The shield, intended to ward off external chaos, became an impenetrable wall, isolating people from the living world. Order stifled curiosity. Security extinguished freedom of thought. And ultimately, once the external threat had passed, the system crumbled under the weight of its own perfection, giving rise to a chaos of ignorance and oblivion that proved more terrifying than any eclipse. The eternal stones of Stonehenge remain silent. They have witnessed everything: the birth of a brilliant idea, its betrayal, long centuries of slumber, and our current, somewhat bustling curiosity. They stand as a monument not only to the greatest triumph of prehistoric intellect, but also to its most crushing failure. They are an enduring reminder of how easily knowledge transforms into power, and power into a prison for the spirit. And gazing upon these stones, the final, ultimate question arises: is history an unbroken cycle where any system designed to protect against chaos is fated to become its very source? Or do we, armed with the knowledge of their mistakes, still have a chance to construct our celestial shield in such a way that it won't one day transform into the walls of our own prison?